welcome back to another episode of Podular Modcast. My name is Tim Held. This week we're going to do something a little different. It won't be your standard interview podcast, but rather a recording of Todd Barton's talk on West Coast synthesis, the three pillars of West Coast synthesis to be exact, from this last weekend's Portland Synth Expo. I do a little Q&A section at the end, but it's mostly just Todd giving us his wisdom. It was lovely to see Todd and everybody else out there at the event. I got to meet a bunch of new people. I got to see some old friends. I have to give a special shout out to Abe from AI Synthesis and his wife Anna. They put me up for the weekend in their lovely home, and I just love those two so much. Got to meet their bartender friends, which makes them sound like way harder partiers than they are, but they just got a little bar around the corner and they were lovely. And I actually ended up going to that bar after the first day of the expo was over and had a nice sit down chat with the fellows from New Systems Instruments. So that's going to be coming next week. I got some kits from AI and I'm going to do a little video on putting those together and then testing them out. I got to see some really exciting upcoming modules from Weston Precision Audio. Gonna blow your mind, as well as 4MS has some stuff, has a new module coming out. I'm not exactly sure when, but it's a one of a kind, and it's I think it's gonna change the game in certain aspects. So be on the lookout for that. This week's featured artist is actually gonna be a new pal that I met out there at the Synth Expo. His name is Daniel McGinn. He goes by Dead Midi. He was my booth buddy for the weekend. I had the PodMod booth set up, and then right next to me was Daniel. He was representing Board Brain, so that was cool. And yeah, he was very patient with my explosion of stuff that I had there. He kept having to step over everything, and I felt bad, and I kept tidying up, but my family calls me a tornado for a reason. So thank you for your patience on that, Daniel. I also got some really cool modules from Satonics Synths as well as Tidbits Audio. They collaborated on a couple modules. It was actually really cool. Like, you know, you have all these booths with all their modules and stuff, and they actually made what they called their modular menu. And I'll throw a graphic up here on the screen because I just thought it was really fun and clever. But yeah, I got a couple modules from them, one of which is called the Psychedelic Voltage Processor, and you'll see this in a demo video that's coming up on the show. It takes an incoming CV signal and uses LEDs to create all this chaotic random stuff. I can't really speak to it any more than that. I've only used it. I haven't actually learned what everything does, but like any good module, you can use it without knowing what it does. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. So I'll be demoing that soon. I also got this really cool little Vactrol VCA from Satonics and Tidbit. So yeah, we'll be checking these out in the future, but I am using them in the video that's coming up where I demoed the Bastille Basil as well as the Bastille Casper Aikido Dynamic VCA mixer. I want to throw a special shout out to Paolo and Jason from Control Voltage. They really knocked it out of the park setting this whole thing up. It was not just synths, but it was also a guitar pedal expo, so I got to meet some cool people from Red Panda Labs and Catlin Bread, and I got to see a buddy from Empress Effects, so that was really fun. But yeah, there's lots more to share about the weekend in Portland, but I will space it out between this week's episode and next week's. Why don't we check out a little video clip with a Dead Midi track below it. Link to Dead Midi's music in the show description. This week's episode of Podular Modcast is brought to you by Novation and their flagship synthesizer, the Summit. I've been using the Summit a lot to create samples to put into my stereo-triggered sampler from 4MS, as well as just playing keys. It is a lot of fun, it's super easy to use, it's very deep but not at all intimidating, very navigable. It also has been very inspirational for me as far as writing new music. So, if you would like to check this out, please visit the show description and click the link. And once again, thank you to Novation for their support of Podular Modcast. This week's episode is brought to you, as always, by Patchworks Seattle, and they have some exciting news. They have the new Korg ARP 2600 semi-modular synthesizer that has been modernized in the newest 2600M model with features like Midi, a smaller form factor, and a re-engineered lush spring reverb, and that is available at Patchworks. And something else about Patchworks that I have utilized many times is it is a great place to bring in your vintage synthesizers and music gear on consignment, or you can do some trade for store credit. Patchworks is located in the heart of the Wallingford neighborhood in Seattle. You can stop by the showroom to play vintage synthesizers and shop new and used gear. Also has a ton of live events, from in-store showroom sessions with local artists to in-depth workshops and classes. And here's another cool piece of information. If you are shopping online at Patchworks, free shipping for orders over $75. And then one last thing, they are updating their showroom hours. So Patchworks will be now open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from noon to 7 p.m. and Sunday from noon to 6 p.m. So it will be closed Monday through Wednesday. Once again, that's patchworks.com, Patchwerks. I'd like to thank everybody who supports me on Patreon. If you would like to support PodMod, head over to patreon.com/PodularModcast. I don't have health insurance, so if you would like to see me have some health insurance, that would be a great help over there at Patreon. Digital panhandling. It's so much fun. Also, thank you to Patchworks for their continued support of Podular Modcast, of course, Novation, 4MS, and After Later Audio. Okay, let's check out the Basil from Bastille. Okay, so what is going on in this here patch? Quite a lot. The gist is I'm using the Weston AD110 drum machine and running that into one of the inputs, the left input on the Bastille Basil. I'm using the triphase oscillator from New Systems Instruments, and all of these signals are going into the Bastille Aikido as well. And I'm using all these modulation sources to modulate the Basil as well as the Aikido. And then you can see as I'm turning that knob on that Factoral VCA down there, what I'm actually doing is running the mix output from the Aikido into that VCA and then into the right input of the Basil. So that's creating like this feedback loop that's only getting fed in there when I turn that knob. I'm passing all sorts of voltages from the Buchla source of uncertainty into the psychedelic voltage processor. That's the upper left corner colorful blinky guy. Well, I guess the video's in black and white, so you can't see the colors. Yeah, so just lots of crazy modulation. One thing I do want to note about the modulation going into the Aikido is I'm using the VCA inputs there as well as the sidechain input. And the modulation that's going in there is going between sub-audio into audio rate. So it's actually, so when those CV signals go audio rate into the Aikido, we're getting some extra harmonics. So that's also what's going on. So yeah, I'm just messing around with the different CV ins, controlling the New Systems Instruments inertia, which is a really crazy like slew generator thing. It's much more complicated than that, but we're going to talk about that next week with Evan from New Systems. I'm modulating the filter, blur, and taps parameters on the Basil with all of this modulation as well. So just a lot of crazy stuff happening. Once again, I made a huge patch that would have been way too confusing to walk you through point by point, especially for the audio listeners. So I hope what I just told you is enough information for you to grasp how cool this basil and aikido are.
Well, hi, I'm Todd Barton, and thank you all for being here. Basically, I'm a happy hermit, but it's really nice to be among friends, family, and fellow electronic musicians, and little fuzzy mics. Yes. Okay. You need a boom.
I know what. Yeah, it's a whole story.
Oh.
Is that gonna annoy you?
Ready for my close-up? Bill. Also want to thank Paolo, who from Delicious Audio, who's made this whole thing happen. Thomas Fang from 4MS, and also Jason from Control Voltage, who helped all put this together. So thanks to all of them, and I'm just happy to see you all. And it's going to be fun to chat. I'm going to be talking about West Coast synthesis, but before I go down that meme, let's just point out that when we talk about sound and music coming from electricity, there are no labels. It's all wide open, okay? And labels can be, they can be empowering, they can be destructive, they can be clarifying, they can be confusing. They can be helpful, and they can be hurtful. And so hopefully this is helpful. And I don't really believe in this East Coast, West Coast label, but especially in this day with synthesis, I mean, all the modules that are coming out are a blend. I mean, there's so much. If we talk about Moog as East Coast and Buchla, Surge as West Coast, I mean, you get wave folding low pass gates in just about every module that's coming out these days. So I don't think that distinction has gone away. So what I'm bringing to the table, though, is looking back at Moog and Buchla historically. I think mid-60s, and what I'll be focusing on is like early 1970s when Big Moogs and the first 200, Buchla 200 came out. And the differences between them, I think, bring to the table what I've learned about Don Buchla Surge's aesthetic more than anything else. And, in a way it's like, it's comparing like a shakuhachi, which is a Japanese bamboo flute, to a transverse flute. Okay? Shakuhachi is made out of bamboo. It has 5 holes, the size of a pencil. The transverse flute has holes that are the size of a dime and needs all these mechanical things. You blow them the same way. It's like a Coke bottle, but this is a Coke bottle this way. They both make great music. It's basically who's playing them, right? So, end of that discussion. So, let's take a quick look at, when we're talking electronic music, anything can become anything. But the labels, West Coast and East Coast, didn't really come into the conversation until about a decade ago, which is interesting. I think I traced it back thanks to Doug I looked up, Doug Cloder was saying, I think it was Grant Richter that created these things, and I looked it up on Mod Wiggler, and yes, 2007. But in 2010, I was writing articles, and I hadn't even heard about it. I didn't see it in any of the journals. It was in the underground forums that this conversation was taking place. So let's look at that. Let's look at the explosion of analog synthesis, which, yeah, there was Eurorack in the late 90s and stuff, but I really blossomed like 2008, 2010. So it's a young thing, and I lived through the dark ages of modular analog synthesis, which started in 1985 when everything went digital. You know, DX7 came out, the Korg M1 came out. Everyone said, digital is the way. And I said, no, no, no. And they said, you're nuts, Todd. And I said, okay. And they said, here. And they gave me all their analog synths. And I went, yes. So, but then analog synths came back. And let's see, in broad strokes, as I've talked about, it's sort of like Moog is the East Coast and Buchla is the West Coast. Thank goodness somebody has left the East Coast up here for us. Perfect. That's, yes, look at that. Keyboards. Yes. West Coast. No keyboards, cables, touch plates, ways of interfacing biologically with the organism, if you will. Yeah, while we're on keyboard, before we do that, turn to your hymnals, please. Yeah, page, what is it, 1, 2, 3. You hold it in landscape. This is what I think is the essence of East Coast. Look at all those familiar things, right? Oscillator, filter, low frequency oscillator, envelope generator. And the thing is, this is what I grew up on, because all the books, even though I was playing a surge, all the books I could get in the 70s were like Moog and Roland and Korg, and they were all saying, you start with an oscillator, and then you go through, you get a good buzzy sound, you put it through a filter, you subtract that, you come out to an amplifier, and you can throw some envelope generators and LFOs to liven up the sound. Okay. And usually fixed waveforms. We'll get into that in a moment. This is my take on West Coast synthesis, where East Coast is linear, West Coast, I think, is centripetal. That is, you have an oscillator, usually a dual oscillator, which started back in the 60s, and you throw tons of control voltage in it. And you have lots of different outputs. Okay, this is way different. And you cross-modulate them, that's just guaranteed. So you get richer, more diverse sounds. Okay? Whoops. Yeah. Oh, goody. Yes, I knew I was going to enjoy this one. Yeah, I used to do magic. But,
Does that thing bite?
So, patch cable, 1/4 inch. This is what Moog used, right? And it's point to point. And it's take an oscillator, go to a filter. Total good East Coast. West Coast. Output. To multiple outputs. Think of a touch plate, right? Where body capacitance, this is the other thing. Body capacitance, the more flesh, the more resistance, the more the voltage changes. And now I can send this to pitch, to vibrato, to timbre, to all sorts of things, modulation index. And I'm currently deep diving again into Alan Strange's book called Electronic Music, which was just reprinted.
Oh, yeah.
And and Alan and Dawn and Alan's wife, Pat, Steve Ruppenthal and Frank McCarty had a thing called the Electric Weasel Ensemble. They were all played Buchla easels in the 70s. And in Alan Strange's book, I call him the Don Buchla Whisperer, because Don was pretty opaque and didn't talk a lot. But Alan has unfolded a lot of the secrets. And part of that is Alan starts talking about West Coast. Term wasn't around, but what I'm talking about is he compares it to the violin. And the violin, you have pitch, vibrato, you have bow. Depending on the speed and strength, you have volume or dynamics. If you're playing near the bridge, you have more harmonics. If you're playing sul tasto over the fingerboard, it's really fluty. And this finger can do harmonics. I mean, you have two things that are controlling lots of parameters. That's the key. Lots of parameters. Lots of parameters. And so a touch plate, a touch plate and a slider, or a touch plate and a knob, I always feel I'm playing a violin or something like that. I'm playing an acoustical instrument. And I think that's where Don was going. He wanted new music, sounds, but everybody wanted sounds they hadn't heard before. But what happens when you put a keyboard on it? Thank you, Herb Deutsch, who Bob Moog said, hey, what do we do? How do we control this? And Herb goes, well, I teach at a university and keyboards are all over the place. This will make it accessible. Absolutely. So it was more of a convenient decision, I think. It wasn't necessarily a philosophical decision. The thing with keyboards is they are percussion instruments, okay? They started in the Middle Ages with little tiny organs that you would hold and had a bellows, and you play a few notes, and it's key on, opens the pipe, key off, pipe closed. There's no aftertouch, there's no vibrato, there's nothing, it's flat out go. And then it's harpsichords, right? Okay, hit the key, this little crow quill plucks a string, game over. You can't sustain it. It's a percussion instrument, okay? And of course, yeah, I know, we can program them to do different things now, but it still elicits that interaction, right? Whereas a touch plate or a breath controller brings out a whole nother, or just turning knobs. What was my, oh yeah, saw a video on the other day, and some grad student at the Institute of Sonology in The Hague was talking about, he said Don Buchla mentioned that, in his opinion, to use knobs and wires to interact with sound is the best way to get involved with different aspects of music, with timbre, with space, instead of rhythm and pitch. We're going to look at that some more down the road here. Oh yeah, one last thing. I'm thinking you're all synth people over there. Well, some of you I know play guitar, right? But since there's pedals galore over there, I thought I at least had to address that. So I use guitar pedals with my easel, but guitar pedals again are pretty much this one, right? You hook this pedal and then you have your cool pedal board and you just keep doing in series. Well, if you really want to get West Coast about your pedals, you have your mono guitar coming into the first pedal and it has a stereo out, so you take left and you go to a fuzz box, and you take right and you go to a ring modulator, and then you stereo that out and you go to distortion, and then you go to a delay, and then you take that out and you go back to the beginning and you feed it back. Okay, that's West Coast pedaling. Okay, and David Tudor beat us all to it, because that's what David Tudor did in the 70s. He had a table full of pedals, and he had what was called a matrix mixer that he built himself, and a matrix switcher, and so they could all be interacting, and they were Boss pedals. Come on, that's what's going down. But he could feed them back, and he knew he could feel the circuitry, and he could know how to sculpt the sound in real time for performance. Okay. Now we're going to get to this. The 3 pillars. I know it's pretentious. I ripped it off from Philip Kaplow's book, The 3 Pillars of Zen, from the 1970s, but why not? First pillar, variable wave shapes. 1970 Moog oscillator, 3 or 4 fixed wave shapes, each independent outs. 1970, actually if we go back to, we'll go 70, Don Buchla, complex waveform generator, 2 oscillators that can cross-modulate each other, so in that cross-modulation you get unknown. I mean, if you've ever tried to turn a knob really slowly in FM land, it's like, whoa, hello. The other thing that Don created was wave folding, right? Take a sine wave, the simplest wave, fold it in on itself, and it adds harmonics. It's not quite additive synthesis, but it's a cousin, I would say. Additive synthesis is taking a lot of sine waves. You know, if you're Fourier, you want 1,025 sine waves. And wave folding, so adds these, speaking of that, I couldn't resist. I recently got an ensemble oscillator for 4MS, which is 16 sine waves. We haven't been able to sort of do real additive synth because it just takes lots of computer stuff. There's a few others out there, but I'm totally in love with it because 16 sine waves that can cross-modulate each other. And guess what? It looks like this. It has a ton of CV inputs, and it's in a little circle. So anyway, I thought that was fun. So wave shapes. With wave folding, it's closer to what acoustical instruments are, right? Because just as you fold that wave, you can get hundreds of different subtle waves rather than just a square, a saw, a pulse, a triangle, and a sine, okay? And then he also had wave shaping, so you go from, there was actually wave, mixing, you would go from like a sine to a saw. So at some point there's a little combination of them. And then if we look at Serge, and we all know the Serge story, right? He was hanging out helping Morton Subotnick. Morton Subotnick had the first Buchla and he brought it to New York to do Silver Apples of the Moon, 1967, year before switched on Bach, okay? And Serge was working in the studio, and then Mort got the gig to come back to the West Coast and teach at Cal Arts in Valencia, just north of LA. And he brought Serge with him and said, hey, can you teach some courses? And Serge went, yeah, but nobody can afford these Buchlas, so I'm going to figure out circuits that all my students can DIY and walk out with. So they were really beautiful, simple circuits, but they were brilliant in that dual universal slope generator. I know I'm geeking out, but stay with me. It's a function generator that can turn into an oscillator. We're going to look at it at the very end of this. But when you turn it into an oscillator, when it's in low frequency mode, it's like a square wave, or maybe it's a saw, I don't know, but as it goes up in pitch, it magically turns into a triangle. And you're going, oh wow, how'd that happen? And when did that happen? And then you go higher and it goes sort of back into this really weird looking saw thing again. So that is more like singing. It's more like acoustics. It's not just fixed. Boy, is there some water around?
I got it.
I think there's some bottles.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Otherwise, my voice is going to go pretty soon.
This is fresh and not in my mouth.
Yeah, I've heard that one before.
It's West Coast.
Thank you, Bob.
Many mouths.
So, okay, so variable, and I think I've made my point there. and I guess I'll make this point now, I think what Don and Serge and everybody was trying to do was give electronic musicians the tools to make sounds we've never heard before, but to have all the tools of the acoustic instrumentalist that can shape and make them, thank you so much, make them so evocative, right? This can be evocative, but back in the day, in the 70s, this had potential to even be more evocative, right? So I'll probably say that again, but bears repetition. Okay, next is multiple inputs and outputs. So, even back in the 1963 when Don Buchla created the 158 and 154, is it? Or 144. Anyway, so dual oscillator, but had three multiple outputs. So it's the same, whatever you dial in, you get the same thing 3 times. So the idea of mults, is, we all know it now, but that was pretty hip in 1963. And I think, I looked at that for a long time and went, what's that about? And over the years, I've come to believe it means, okay, you take this wave and you send it to a ring modulator. You take this wave, you send it to a frequency shifter, or a delay, or to a filter, and you take this one, the unaffected one, and send that. And you send all 3 of them to a mixer, and you spatialize that. He was deep into spatialization, even in the 60s. By the 70s, you'll notice that everything comes in quad. Quad low-pass gate, quad function generators, quad everything, because in the early 70s, quad was going to be the future of our home stereo system. Stereo to come out, Philips, Sony, RCA, everyone was developing a quad turntables, and it's like, oh, I wish I could try that. But they, just sort of hit, physics eventually took over and it wasn't happening. In fact, Mort Subotnick was commissioned to do 3 quad albums for, for vinyl, and eventually couldn't do it because they said we can't make the technology to play it back in the house. Anyway, so spatialization, multiple inputs, outputs. And now CV inputs. You may have heard my bumper sticker, you're only as expressive as your control voltages. So the more control voltages you can feed into a static sound, I feel the more expressive. And, we can think of control voltages as envelopes or LFOs, but again, Mort, back in the 60s, when he was working on Silver Apples of the Moon, he went to Don and he said, these fixed LFO stuff, man, I need something more. I need to be able to, create really complex control voltages. So Don went, oh, I know, and went away and created an envelope follower so that Mort could go, and that's an LFO. How do you do that with a fixed LFO? You don't. So again, control voltages and expressivity. I don't know if we need to go all through all of that. Yeah, again, one of my favorite things to do with these, when I have like 7 inputs on an oscillator, is to send different time scales of function generators to it and see what sort of things you get, and not sync them. and you can sync them if you want. But if they're out of sync and one is doing this and one's doing and one's doing you get this beautiful panoply of timbre and sound. Okay. Moving right on. Aha. Now the big one. Multifunctionality. We're going to talk about the Surge Dual Universal Slope Generator. But before we do that, one of the most multifunctional things is on the Buchla music easel, you have a low pass gate, and it's a slider. I love that it's a slider. Because I can see where it is instead of like, oops, the hashtag went over there, I need to, whoa, where are we? No, it's there. And also the beauty of the slider, I remember I made a video of this. If you have the low pass gate, which is a VCA, right, and it's in low pass filter mode, as you move the slider up, you're working the cutoff of the filter. The timbre is changing. But also, if it's in the low, you're also changing the volume. So you're changing amplitude and timbre, and if you're sending like a pulse into that, in the low settings, it's soft and pizzicato. And as you go up, it gets brighter and legato. And so if you can send, a cool set of CVs to that, instead of getting, you get, it's short, long timbre. So I made a video once of just doing that, which with me with one finger, and then I had a buddy and set it up on my MOTM, sort of Moog clone system, which had a filter and a pulsar, had all that stuff. And so you see me turning up the amplitude and changing that, and then a third hand comes in to change the timbre, and it's 9 patch cables instead of one little shorting bar. So multifunctionality there. Dual universal slope generator. Okay. It can be an envelope generator, so it can something you can send to a VCA. You can make cool envelopes. It can be a subharmonic oscillator, so you can send like a high pitch into it and you generate low pitches, and you can sweep through harmonics that way. It can be an envelope follower. Thank you. Yes. Oh, I thought you had a question.
Just trying to do it without interrupting.
And it can be an oscillator, which I described to you before, which is great because it changes, it transforms sort of magically. What else? Well, I guess it's all here. I should just read what I already wrote. LFO, pulse generator and clock, pulse divider, slew limiter, so you can do glissandi things, low pass filter, that's wild, it can turn into a filter. So it's an oscillator, you can, if you cross modulate them, you can get noise. It's a filter, it's an LFO, it's an envelope generator, it's a trigger gate, and it can do, clocks. So not bad. It's called the Swiss Army knife module. So what do you do with all of that? Well, you can, again, send it to different places, there's so many possibilities. And then when you feed it back on itself, you get all sorts of craziness, which is sort of where, where my Krell patch, I don't know if any of you know that, but it was years in the discovering, and I was not looking for it, just one night it happened, but it was taking a Buchla function generator and feeding it back on itself and sending random stuff to it that all of a sudden made what I felt was a musical acoustic gesture that breathed, that had breath. It's so easy with electronics to just do, they will go forever until we pull the plug. And we can do nice washy things, or we can do percussive things. But my goal has always been, how do I find a way to make the electronics breathe? How to make phrases so that we as an audience can breathe with the electronics. That's not saying that's the only way to go. It's just sort of what I came from an acoustical background. So there you have it. The other, where else? The other thing, I guess with I'll finish up with, something we all know as electronic musicians, which is that magic that happens, especially with the universal slope generator or any function generator, where it starts out as like a LFO square wave, and all you hear is and we know if we get fast enough, it turns into pitch. And there's a magic window, I think it's between like 16 to 22 hertz, beats per second, depending on how our ears and what you ate for breakfast, you start to perceive it as pitch. We don't all perceive it at that same moment, which is, again, really organic. And I love looking at the organic possibilities of sound. And that's one of those magic moments. So I think I've covered everything. Now it might be time for some questions. So, thank you.
I was asked to come and help facilitate the Q&A with Todd, which I was very excited to do because I love Todd. But my name's Tim. I host a show called Popular Modcast, and Todd's been on it a number of times, so that's how we met. And yeah,
here we are.
So, does anybody have any questions? I know I have some, but I wanted to give you guys a chance first.
So I was seeing a show about the BBC tape slicing and cutting.
Yes.
They end up with, for instance, the Doctor Who theme.
Right.
And you can watch the people, discover the theme that they cut.
Yeah.
They didn't have a rule to say what it was going to sound like.
Right.
Until it came out.
Yeah.
Did it?
Yeah.
So, how much of that tape world mix in with synthesizer world?
Good question. How much did the tape world mix in with synthesizer world? And yes, that documentary is great. It's about Delia Derbyshire.
Right.
And do you remember the title of it?
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube. At any rate, Delia Derbyshire, spelled Derbyshire. So, yeah, she was at the BBC radiophonic studios for years and was just brilliant. Again, a mathematician and a musician. And that's why she could cut tape so precisely, because she was going like, okay, I want this beat. And it's worth watching at the very end because they play a beat from 1971 that you will swear is techno. And it was all just little pieces of tape spliced together. And how does tape music play into this? Well, historically, those touch plates that Buchla used, that Don in the San Francisco Tape Music Center, we're talking like 1962 to 5 before it moved to Mills, 66, they had a block of wood with copper touch plates, and there were 10 of them. And those were used because they were splicing tape and going, this is so tedious. Why do we have to do that? They're doing it in Europe. They've done it better than we can, blah. So they got a radio, and they're always stealing stuff, right? I mean, not stealing, but they were going to Army surplus and getting old gear because that's all they could afford. And so they got a cart machine that used in radio, right? So you put these little cartridges in there, and they have the information. So they made like tape loops and stuck them in the cartridges, and Don went, oh, okay, well, we'll just trigger start and stop those tape loops with this, so you don't have to go over there and switch. So it was remote control for tape.
Yeah.
Good question. Thanks, Bob.
Well,
Other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious, you said your experience with acoustic instruments has influenced how you approach electronic music. I'm curious after the fact, the way how your experience with electronic music impact how you approach acoustic instruments.
Oh, okay, yeah, the question, because this is probably not picking up, is, how acoustic, I come from an acoustic background, and that has influenced my electronics. How has electronics influenced my acoustics? Great question. I listen deeper. I hear different things. So when I come back to my acoustic instruments, it's like, oh, I'm hearing at a different level. And I have students all around the world, and often many of them are guitar players. And one in particular comes into mind, lives in Colorado, and he just basically, he frigging got a buchla, and just put the guitar away and says, I'm going to learn this. And we spent a couple of years, and then he went back to the guitar and he goes, Todd, it's like stuff I couldn't play before, I can just play now. And I'm hearing it in a different way, and the guitar is different. So hopefully that answers your question.
I've had the exact same experience. I started as guitar, on guitar and little drums in my younger days. Went straight into modular. I'd plink on guitar, but I wasn't taking it seriously. And I just recently got back into drums and playing piano and guitar, and I am better than I've ever been at all three of those instruments. And I think it is because even I had to get my chops back as far as the muscle memory stuff goes. That suffered, but my intuition and everything is completely different. It is rewired.
Yeah.
My brain.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you mentioned listening, because that was going to be kind of the root of a question, because that was some. I know that you're walking and your practice of walking and your deep listening and I forgot where I was going to go with that, because when you started talking about it, I'm like, I think you just answered the question I was going to ask. But yeah, could you expound a bit on that for everybody in here, just like
Sure.
the importance of listening and that practice specifically?
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing, if I'm ever asked about what's the most important thing about composition, what's the most important thing about improvisation, what's the most important thing about performance, what's the most important thing about patching, it's listening. And the deeper you can listen, the more you start to go into the sound, and you have a relationship with the sound. And as Pauline Oliveros said, who created a whole school called deep listening, she said, if the musicians on stage are listening, odds are the audience is too. And we've all been, I think, in various situations where the musicians are not listening on stage, and you can feel that either intellectually or physically or whatever. So, yeah, my practice is I walk every morning and just listen to the environment, whichever environment I'm in. Luckily, I live near trees and things.
Yeah.
But I, like this morning, I was up at 6 o'clock walking around Portland, and it's there's so many cool sounds. Pauline, I'm following Pauline's thing, which is like, okay, you're walking or you're standing, what's the furthest sound away that you can hear? And you listen, and you go, oh, I think that's a plane, and then, oh, it's changing pitch, it's getting closer, the timbre's changing, it's getting louder. Oh, bird. Oh, hello, bird. Bird over here. Oh, another bird over here. Oh, are they talking together? I learn so much every day about mixing and spatially mixing, right? Because in the environment, and then it's like, wow, when did that plane go away? I got pulled over here. one of my good friends grew up in Southern California. We went to college together, and he said when he would go home, he'd go up on, they lived down in a little valley, he'd go up on the hillside, and he'd try to stay focused on when did that playing enter my hearing consciousness, and then stay with it, and then the real game is when did it leave, and it gets really, it's a fun game because it's like, no, didn't leave. Whoa, where'd it go? You know, it's like, it's good ear training. And that's another thing. I've been with this Alan Strange book. Okay. David Tudor, John Cage, Alan Strange, Pat Strange, his wife, super violinist, Morton Subotnick, Pauline Oliveros. They were all consummate acoustic instrumentalists. Pauline played accordion and French horn. That's how she and Mort met. He was playing clarinet. He did clarinet solos all over the place. David Tudor, of course, was the best keyboard player, and let it go to go deep into electronics. But the point being, where am I going with that? Listening, yeah, it's again the whole listening thing and feeling the sound. I guess since I riffed on David Tudor, everyone said Tudor's touch on the piano was bar none the best. He could do timbral things that nobody believed, and he was playing classical music. And at the age of 19, he took a piano apart and looked at the action, and which is key to like this weird thing. Then hammer hits the string, and when hammer hits the string, it has to immediately bounce back, and it's called the escapement, and it's like nanoseconds, and that's the way you can play the same note over. And so he was sitting there doing that, and when people asked him what was up, why can you do things that nobody else can, he says, it's all in the escapement. That is where I listen. And it was like, okay, we're talking listening and feeling, and he could control the nanoseconds of escapement consciously. So, yes, listening.
That changed my entire approach to not only patching and mixing, but just like I used to fall asleep listening to music. Now, I used to live in a noisy neighborhood. We moved to a not so noisy neighborhood. Now I do field recordings overnight in nature to listen to when I go to bed, because there's not enough interesting sounds at my house anymore. Like I need, and I feel like that deep listening, learning, because that's something else that you said when you first told me about this, probably 4 or 5 years ago, was how you were getting better at hearing things further away and getting better at spotting them in, in space, and how, and like, I don't know, that really, really stuck with me, and I feel like it's something I still apply constantly. So thank you for that.
Good.
Yeah, it's great.
Well, thank you. And just to finish off Pauline's on that, she goes, what's the furthest sound? What's the midway between you and that sound? And what's the closest sound? And that gets really interesting, because that gets down to, oh, yeah, I can hear my breath. Oh, I can hear, if I'm walking, this is really subtle, but it's really there. And, oh yeah, what's that tempo? And what's this tempo to my heartbeat, which if I put my finger in my ear, I can hear. And you learn about all these different time scales that are going on in the organic world, and that you can bring to your music. Yeah.
It's like kind of a good segue. I'm just sitting with this idea of, when we talk about straight sine waves and saw waves and stuff just being so just it's a static thing, right? You mentioned how dynamic waveforms of all kinds are just so much more colorful and interesting, and I'm definitely feeling very inspired by the ideas of using those types of dynamic waveforms as with whatever like generation, any of that type of stuff, to dynamically create the sound. I'm curious. Like it started, popping all these ideas into my head about types of ways of essentially sampling sounds from different types of events or like things in nature or like any number of things. I'm curious if you've ever had an idea where you wanted to use this, like, or you've had an idea about something that would be really cool to use as that type of source, but you didn't have like the means by which you captured it to, maybe it's like something that just like it would be very difficult or impossible to actually record or like sample.
Yeah. Actually, the older I get and the more time I spend in this, I sort of take to heart a David Tudor quote that I love, because he would build these little DIY boxes that would make sounds and stuff. And he said, I don't try to make the instrument do what I want to do. I try to listen, listening to what it wants to do. And that's sort of where I come from. I'm not trying to make sounds, and especially in performance, I have no idea usually when I pull up the slider on the easel what sound I'm going to get. In fact, I often ask people to come up and just move sliders with the sound off. So I have no clue. And then I pull the volume up and it's like, here we go. And, as Alan Strange and David Tudor would say, it will tell you what it wants to do. If you listen to it, you can start to follow it. You can have a dialogue with it, and it can unfold in interesting ways. And you can say, what if? What if I push it this way? And it's like, oh, okay, we're going here now. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of taking that a step farther with the sort of technology of it, the number of modules that seem available. How do you, in this sort of day and age of access, say it's time to add another friend to my box, or to say, how do I push what I have?
Right.
To make those decisions of it's time to add something more to how do I utilize what I have more creatively and understanding the balance. That's what scares me to death about modular.
Okay.
There's an infinite number of things to put in your app.
Right. Like I said before, right. When you're making sounds from electricity, it's all open. And the question is, paraphrasing it for the mic, is like, at what point do you decide to add another friend to the box, or do you just focus on what's going down? For me, and I have lots of modules, but I still follow the philosophy of Don and Alan, which is they called patching instrument definitions. And so they would patch a constellation of modules and call that an instrument and learn to play it. And again, they're coming from, how many hours did I put in as a kid in the practice room learning trumpet, and how many hours did they do. So I will create an instrument, and then I will spend a lot of time with it and learn it and have a relationship with it. Actually, you must have read to the end. The last page.
I didn't see it, but I guess I intuited it.
Less is more. Challenge yourself to get the most out of a single module. And if you have a relationship with a module and then add, and say you have like 5 modules, live with that for a month or two. A good friend who passed a while ago was Richard Lanehart, and he had an 18 module Buchla, and it was a 200E, so it could memorize 30 instrument definitions. And he spent like years patching that, and he left that patch for, he performed only that patch for 3 years. And he could do wonders, you know. If you know your instrument, you know, you can do stuff. That's not to say, I also spend a lot of time just going, well, let's do that. You know, let's patch a bunch of stuff. Yeah, let's get another module. And find out if it plays nicely.
I like the idea of creating an instrument and sort of living with that and pushing it to its limits and then saying, okay,
Right.
I think I've done enough.
Yeah, right. It's like a violin, you know, 4 strings. It can play Bach. It can play, you know, crazy extended techniques. It can play rock and roll. It can play heavy metal. It, you know, you name the label, it can do it. But it's the person playing it. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to add, even possibly a counterpoint too, is that, you know, in my early days or whatever, I kind of looked at my modular as an instrument, and I'm like, okay, what am I missing in this instrument? Continually adding stuff. Okay, got, you know, something that I feel is workable, and I didn't stop buying modules.
Correct.
And now I'm kind of at a point where there's a library of modules that I can just kind of say, I want an idea, and I'll just compose, you know, a cluster of things from a library,
Yeah.
rather than kind of saying, this is my, you know, these are the modules I have, you know, for this instrument. It's like, here's a module, or here's a library, I can just kind of pick a few here. I want these 3 or 4 together.
Right.
That's what I do as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Right. And you know them, and so you can play them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The 4MS guys show this new module that's coming out next time, and you can have 4 ensemble oscillators. You know.
Yes.
Total. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to add and bring attention to one of the simplest things that you shared with me one time, and I'm sure with many other synthesis, is just when in doubt, do the opposite. In fact, I added the doubt, but do the opposite. Explore the opposite.
Say what?
Just exploring the opposite of any aspect of composition or creation.
Right.
That just changed everything
Oh,
for me.
good.
I
think, like, to kind of expound upon that or kind of reword it, something, when I made my first, like, full-length electronic album, I had no gear. I had bad, cheap gear, and I still wanted, so I knew it wasn't going to sound good. So I leaned into, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to just lean into my limitations. And so I feel like when you feel maybe like limited and if something's making, like, this thing's not working for me, well, then maybe that's the thing that you keep, like, okay, I'm going to keep doing the thing on this that's not working for me. And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, maybe this is working now, you know, like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to expound on do the opposite, that was in the context of if you have a patch and you don't know where to go, take one knob and slowly turn it to the opposite position and then keep doing that. And if you go slow enough, you'll find whole new ball games, universes happening. Yeah.
It kind of ties into all this. So, like, if I'm composing for acoustic instruments, I know when I'm done. But with this, like, how do you develop the skill to kind of know, you know, with electronics, because it's infinite variations and you can keep on experimenting forever?
Yeah, that's a good question. As John Cage said, it's so good I'd hate to ruin it with an answer. But again, if you know your instrument, you start to feel the sound, and you know, I mean, compositionally, Edgar Varese, early electronics, right? Said form or structure is not about we create form and throw content into it. He says form is like a crystal growing. And so a crystal starts and then it grows and then another facet starts and it grows, and that you look at it and goes, yeah, that's a crystal, and oh, that's a crystal. They look completely different, but they're crystals. And they stop. So I think you will develop the intuition that you have for acoustic instruments with the again, just having that relationship with sound. And as I say, follow the sound, and it'll tell you when it's done.
It's incredibly fun to build curl patches with that in mind. Just kind of like, start with a feedback cycle or something, and then just kind of add, remove, add a little bit, and then kind of find the right balance.
Cool.
Very rewarding.
Oh, good. Yay.
I have one question. It's not really on topic, but I'm just curious. So, okay, let's just say Surge, your Hordite, Buchla, Eurorack. Are there 4 moods that would make, like this mood would pull me towards wanting to choose this as my compositional tool today, or?
Oh, good question. I don't approach it with I'm in a mood. I approach it like, what's the Hordite telling me today?
Okay.
And so I'll go to the Hordite and go, oh, hello, and sometimes I'll spend 2 hours and we're not having a conversation. That's also part of the deal, right? It's not like we have to be inspired all the time. In fact, most of the time, but you have to show up every day and go, hi, honey, can we talk? And yeah.
I knew I was going to get a Todd Barton answer out of that question. I love it.
How are we doing on time?
I think we're about at an hour.
Yeah, I think there's another group in here, so.
Yeah, we're at 56 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you all. It's so good to see you.
All right, that's our show. Thank you so much once again to Paolo and everybody who helped get the Portland Synth Expo set up. Also, huge thanks to Todd Barton for his wonderful talk and for allowing me to use it as some podcast material. Take heed his wisdom. He knows what's up. Once again, if you'd like to support the show on Patreon, head over to patreon.com/PodularModcast. Thank you to Patchworks, After Later Audio, 4MS, and Novation for their continued support of Podular Modcast. Don't forget to check out the Basil from Bastille, as well as the Aikido Dynamic VCA Mixer. Thank you to Dead Midi for the awesome track. If you would like to be a featured artist on Podular Modcast, hit me up on Discord or Instagram or via email through podmodcast@gmail.com. This week's secret word is, let's do psychedelic basil. Thank you so much for coming back to Podular Modcast. Until next week.